Thanks for turning out to the topic which I thought was incredibly boring, evaluation at 11:30 in the morning after Lord Putnam. And I never saw Lord Putnam's speech, but I'm sure it was absolutely brilliant. So the duty dench, I gave a keynote at Future Labs conference, and it was all teachers, and a guy got really angry. I saw him in the back, bubbling away at some of the things I was saying, and he stood up and said, and he accused me of being the Jeremy Clarkson of the e-learning industry. And what I didn't know is I actually don't have a driving license. I've never driven a car in my life. This is absolutely true. I'm like Gordon Brown. So that was my retort back to him. I couldn't think of anything else to say, to be honest. But I mean, the Judy Dench, I'm not too sure about Judy Dench, but there we are. At this time of year, I do a blog, and just before Christmas or in January, you get people phoning you up or emailing you, say, could you do a prediction for 2010, Donald, And I read some of them, and they're either a statement of the bleeding obvious or they don't come true anyway. But I declined for this year because I'm sort of getting a bit pissed off with the training world because nothing new ever seems to happen, I've been ranting and railing against all these things for years, but every year seems to be frank, much the same as the previous year in terms of pedagogic theory and evaluation and some of these things I'll be talking about today. As an industry, if you want to call it that, we're sort of fixed narratives, And the Kirkpatrick narrative is the narrative in evaluation, and Gagne is the narrative in terms of the sort of feedback loops on that pedagogic side. And there are lots of these. My least favorite, number one narrative, which I absolutely hate with a vengeance, is the breakout group. When suddenly the trainer says, we're all going to sit in little round tables, could you all move there? And could you choose a chair? And the extrovert picks themselves on the table. And then the extrovert gathers all the opinions of the people around the table, then stands up and just gives their personal view. In the flip chart paper peeling off the walls, and the person promises to give you the feedback, you never get it. And this is, it's an illusory narrative because it's of no use to man or beast that, Half the time it's just administering it. And there's a pretense at collaborative learning. Whenever a breakout group comes out, I'm just heading for the door, guys. It's been going on for decades, this stuff, and it's lazy thinking. That's my number one. But my number two is Kirkpatrick. Really, I'm 53 years old, and Kirkpatrick wrote this. It isn't a theory, by the way. It's got no academic basis whatsoever. But he wrote it in 1959 when I was 3 years old. And we haven't given it a moment's reflection since. We just drill it out in those crappy train-the-trainer courses, along with every other bit of 50-year-old theory, whether it's Bloom, Gagne, whatever, and we unthinkingly apply it. And it's my number two because I think it's actually a massive millstone around our necks, which has held this industry back, has squeezed it into a lowly dark corner in corporations because it's crap. I've been on lots of boards in my life. I'm currently on a load of boards. I never hear training at board level. And believe me, there isn't a senior manager on the planet who's ever heard of Kirkpatrick or is indeed interested in Kirkpatrick. And so when I hear this excuse about the Kirkpatrick schema, which is, all the board demands it, the senior managers demand it. No, they don't. The training industry has fed it upwards for so long that they started to believe that those people were actually demanding it. The only people who've ever heard of Kirkpatrick are people in the training industry. And it's a huge millstone because it actually is worse than a bad theory. It actually stops proper evaluation from taking place. That's the tragedy of this schema. And we know this because every year ASTD, CIPD figures come out, and it's absolutely clear that we spend all our time doing level 1 evaluation, which says nothing about learning. It's no use to anyone whatsoever. We sometimes crawl up into level 2 with some crappy pre- and post-tests around the courses, which has no real efficacy in terms of whether people actually learn anything in the real world. We hardly ever get to... Have you really ever seen people going around with behavioural checklists in the workplace? I've been in this industry for 25 years and never seen it yet. And then level 4, nobody quite gets there because that's a bit dangerous. You might get found out there. Imagine trying to... Really. Another thing about the whole evaluative business in training is it's always positive. It never comes out and says, this training course was really shit, and we should stop it right now. What a complete and utter waste of money. It's always this huge optimistic bias towards proving the positive on every single course, or perhaps pointing out a few little flaws for future improvement on the course next year. So it's a destructive force. That's my problem with this. That's why it's number 2 on my list. And whenever I think about evaluation, I'll tell you a little story. It's sort of oblique but relevant in this. When I was at university, a long time ago, 30-odd years ago, I shared a room with a guy called Robin Pearson. And he was always away at weekends in Europe, and he always seemed to have loads of money. He spoke fluent German, and he was a really bright guy. Years and years later, I'm sitting with my wife, Jill, watching Panorama, and up comes a picture of Robin Pearson. And we go, Christ, that's Robin. I went on holiday with this guy, spent a lot of time drinking with him. And it turns out that he was the head of the Stasi in the UK. He was the Stasi's top man in the UK. He had employed loads of academics all through the UK. It was an absolute shock, because one, he never told me. Second, he never tried to recruit me. I thought I was pretty left-wing. But then, a weird thing happened. The wall came down, the Berlin Wall. He got found out because they found his file. And the wall came down in 1989. But if you've ever been to Berlin and gone to the Stasi Museum, there's a very strange thing, and it's well documented in a book called Stasiland, which I recommend, which is when they went into the Stasi headquarters, they found loads of these jars with big rubber seals stuck on the top of them. And they had no idea what these jars were at first. There was nothing inside them but loads of names and numbers on the labels. And it turns out that the Stasi, when interrogating people, would actually steal people's clothes or interrogate them with towels and then get the smell of their sweat, put the towel in the jar, leave it and pull it out so that the dogs could hunt those people down if they tried to go over no man's land across the wall. Now, the Stasi, of course, were on this ridiculously Teutonic search for that minutiae in terms of collecting people's smells. And meanwhile, they missed the big picture, because meanwhile, the good people of East Germany had enough and said, we've had enough of this, threw them out, and that was the end of the whole affair. And I think in the training world, there's an analogy here. I think we're collecting smells half the time in evaluation. It's that useless, the Happysheet data. It is that useless. And we're missing the big picture. We're going nowhere near what we should be doing in terms of aligning our activity with business objectives and proving as to whether they work or not. We're nowhere near that. In fact, we avoid it, we overtake it, we undercut it, we just never get near it. You'll recognize these logos at the top here. Now, if our evaluative techniques work, what actually happened here? I spent a lot of time working for these, not that one, but these two organisations, delivering training and so on. But if you go now into the Royal Bank of Scotland and ask these questions, what actually happened with those millions and millions of pounds that you spent on leadership training that seemed to result? The leaders of these organisations basically came up with a big Ponzi scheme to rip you all off. They succeeded grandly and managed to escape with the loot. And they were fed on a diet of motivational speaking and false evaluation. All of this leadership training was bogus. It produced megalomaniac, narcissistic, solipsistic leaders. That's what happened. That's what Fred Goodwin is. But have we reflected on whether any of this leadership training was at fault here? Has anybody really evaluated leadership training in organizations and looked at its impact on organizations? Because in these organizations, it was catastrophic for them and almost every single person in this room. The compliance training, sorry, I did this in a hurry, spelled that wrong. Compliance training, I'm guilty. A lot of money in delivering crap compliance training into financial institutions. It didn't matter a jot, to be honest. Nobody learned a damn thing. The non-ethical selling of mortgages has been going on for years and years and years. I remember 20 years ago doing a program for the Halifax Building Society where we got all the people who were working as tellers in the branches in a big call centre, and because people had got into arrears, I don't know, some of you are old enough to remember the previous depression when people got into real trouble with their mortgages, and we'd phone people up 10 minutes before Coronation Street started, en masse, because you knew they'd be sitting there, and they would want to get their debt paid off because they wanted to get watching the TV. It was stupid, but the compliance training in the financial institutions never worked. Mainly because it didn't actually change attitudes at all. It was a whole box ticking. enterprise and treated like a joke. And I ran a PLC and used to spend a lot of time in the city. Twice a year I'd go in and speak to loads of fund managers, and when I mentioned e-learning, the first thing they'd mention was the crappy money laundering courses that they had to go through and how they treated it like a joke. And the joke was on us, because ineffective training, no attitudinal change, resulted in a disaster for all of us. And forget business ethics. It went right out the window. But none of this stuff is being evaluated, truly, in terms of its impact on the organization, or else we'd be stopping all right now. We'd be stopping all that crappy leadership training that produced these charismatic leaders, so-called. And then diversity training is another one, very interesting. There are hundreds of millions of pounds being spent worldwide on diversity training in organizations in public and private sector. And my heart sinks when I'm going aboard and somebody says, Donald, you've got a compulsory diversity training course to go on. And I go, oh, please, I've been in loads of them. Don't put me through this. You know? It won't work. Honestly, I'm not a racist. I've had enough of this stuff. And it's usually some crap lawyer that I've hired for a day who stands there and tells you endless detail about the law, which you don't need to know anyway, by the way. It's all about attitudinal shift. But hardly any of those diversity trainers have ever evaluated anything. And when you point out that the biggest evaluation study that I actually know of any training topic on the planet is as follows, Frank Dobbins at Harvard. He looked at diversity training in 708 companies, okay, this is all private sector, and found that the practices that target managerial bias through diversity training show virtually no effect. No effect whatsoever. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, no effect whatsoever. Now, that's bad enough. What's worse is that nobody's ever heard of this study. Certainly none of the people who are delivering diversity training. Even worse, at the tail end of the study, he's very level-headed, and he took a lot of very good raw labor data. This is really, really good science. Research today suggests that the training often generates a backlash. So not only does it have no effect, by and large, on most of the studies, on the meta-studies, in many cases, he found that it had the equal opposite effect. And I went to a brilliant lecture recently by a guy who had been in lots of primary schools in the UK with a camera. He was a filmmaker. And he went in, he got paid to do this under local authority schemes teaching racism to young kids in primary schools. But after 12 years of doing this, he had had enough. And he gave this marvelous talk, and he showed it all in video evidence of these young kids, you know, and the theatre group would pop in with a little play about racism, you know, and all these 6-year-olds would be sitting there wondering what on earth was going on. And then the leader of the play group, the theatre group, would come up and say, right, kids, you know, can you tell me, give me an example of a minority group? And the kids would go, Manchester City supporters. And, you know, and the kids around there, they had not an ounce of racism in them. They were completely and utterly colourblind, with all the black and brown kids all mixed up with them and so on. But, of course, then the theatre group had to introduce the concept of racism to them, because they had no idea. And the kids are sitting there absolutely bamboozled by this, why they're going through this experience. And a lot of this overkill is present in training. We sort of automatically get this narrative. We must have diversity training. We must have compliance training. It must do this. It must do that. And we just slam the stuff out there in huge, big slabs. And it doesn't work. Because if we really were honest to ourselves and we did the honest evaluation and looked at these studies, we'd stop a lot of it. But we don't, because we're chasing down budget and we'll do crap stuff for any old, you know. You know, the danger is we become prostitutes in organizations. We'll do anything for money. You know? And this is just not right. I've been controversial enough at the start, surely. Okay, now let's turn to Donald. 1959, you know, 51 years ago. The problem with the theory is that it's not a theory. I mean, even Kirkpatrick himself, have you ever seen Kirkpatrick speak? He was absolutely bamboozled as to why people have latched onto this thing. He wrote it as a sort of little adjunct to his PhD thesis. He did no research whatsoever. He just scribbled some questions down on a piece of paper. And for some reason, it had a sort of early viral effect. Everybody latched onto it because the questions were nice and simple. And there's nothing the training world loves more than a simple 4-level thing you can put in a table, or the Maslow triangle that you can put in PowerPoint, or learning styles in 4 sectors from Honey and Mumford. That's all we need. If you can get a diagram on a PowerPoint slide, that's good enough for us. You know, triangle, circle, table, four-way quadrant, that's enough. Don't worry about any of the academic research behind it. By the way, Honey and Buffer there's no academic basis to it whatsoever. Neither has Maslow. None of this stuff was ever validated. But it's like the gospel in Train the Trainer courses. Just like old fossils just lying around, being brought out in the dusty old cabinet every time you run one of those courses. And the problem with this date is that the world of psychology was still entranced in B.F. Skinner-type behaviourism. Behaviourism ruled the world in those days. That really was the orthodoxy. And, of course, he was brought up in this tradition. And all he did was throw out a few behaviourist questions. In other words, wait till somebody's done something and then ask them some questions at the end. Forget about asking them before it starts or doing any evaluation before any of the training starts. You know, and that's the big weakness here. The behaviourist always does that. Waits, then does the business. But, of course, in other areas, in an organisation, in marketing and so on, nobody does this. You wouldn't launch anything. You wouldn't launch... Do you think that Apple are going to launch an iSlate without having asked or done any focus group work? Do you think you'd launch a Mars bar and then ask everybody on a happy sheet whether they liked Mars bars or not? It's a damn stupid way to do it. No sampling. And even the sampling on Happysheets is just the people who happen to have pens or have one stuck to their arse when they walk out the door. It's just a scientifically stupid way to gather data. And yet, it's the primary means of everybody does a happy sheet thing. The least interesting aspect of evaluation. Now, you know there's something up when somebody who looks like Donald Patrick comes along and starts selling, because Donald's getting on now. He's about 89, I think, or something. And I feel bad kicking an 89-year-old guy around the room a little bit here. But I feel okay about kicking this guy around the room. This happens to be his son. There must be something wrong with a theory where your son, you just take over. You know, there must be something wrong with that, really. You know? So the Son of God has come along, James, and he just trots out the same. He's not very bright, James, actually. He's rather smart, you know. This guy just trots out the same. And, of course, for the last 50 years, it's been a vigorous defense of the indefensible. You know, he's a very good speaker. Donald's a good speaker, actually. And all he's done is adapt his theory to anything that comes along. Nobody's really looking at whether the theory works in the first place or not. And we all know, I'm sure you're no strangers to the 4 levels in the theory. So why do we need to scrap it? Well, I've rattled on about having a theoretical basis, rehashed behaviourism. And then there's this notion that as a theory, it's just overloaded. Nobody goes through 4 different sets of value. Even hard-nosed marketing people, big launch budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars in products, over-engineer in the way that the training people do. And of course, the net result of this 4 levels approach to life is we start off in level 1 up, and then we get a bit exhausted by level 2, we never get to level 3, and hardly ever get to level 4. Because the schema pushes you in that direction. And it's easy to default to level 1, because it's easy to photocopy a sheet with some half-baked questions on it. So the 4 levels, the linear nature of the evaluation, in a sense prevents us ever reaching the mighty heights of business impact. Narrow-minded behaviour, and it's too summative, ignores context. In fact, it ignores almost everything that's useful in training. And don't imagine for one bit that level 2 ever gets near retention and long-term memory in pre- and post-testing. It ignores other methods of delivery. In other words, it's completely and utterly neutral with regard to whether me standing here and talking to you, or e-learning, or workshops, or simulations, or games actually have any effect. So, in a sense, it perpetuates the justification for bad practice. It never really says anything about delivery and whether your classroom training has any real efficacy. So classroom training is still the dominant method of delivery in training, because there's no evaluation of classroom training. And do you think there's any evaluation of the 1-hour lecture in universities, even though we know it's a heap of crap? Even though we know as students we're not going to turn up to them? Do you think anybody has even sat down and said, we're going to stop this now? Now, they're being forced into it a little bit because there's some IT guy in university who comes along and says, I think we should record the lectures, and about 90% of them go absolutely apeshit at the very idea of recording the lectures, even though it makes perfect sense for the learners and pedagogically. And eventually it's starting to happen now because YouTube EDU and iTunes U and all that stuff is forcing them against their will. So the people that teach are the worst possible offenders when it comes to evaluating their own practice. And of course the people who teach in universities, and sometimes in schools, although less so, are often completely and utterly ill-qualified to stand and deliver a one-hour lecture. Some of you have been through surely some of you have been through degree courses and know with absolute certainty that this is the case. Somebody who's got a first in maths and is teaching maths is going to be a crap teacher. David Cameron came out recently and said, what we want is more first-class honours degree graduates in schools. No, we want to sack those people. We want to get rid of them. They're causing the damage. Teaching skills are different from subject matter expertise. There's a big difference. And we'll be making big mistakes if we regard our evaluative process as the degree itself in teaching. That's a disaster. So we get this perpetuation of poor practice, okay? The level 1 thing. I've already said, if you've got a pen, who fills in Happysheets? Maybe the people who are really angry or the people who really liked it. Most people don't, in my experience. If you've been along at dozens and dozens of conferences, the whole thing is hopelessly haphazard with regard to the sampling on this. So scientifically, you shouldn't really be taking that data. If you're doing it properly, you'd have somebody who really was sampling at the door, taking every 10th person that left or whatever. You make some effort, but no effort is made at all on Happysheets to sample. And sampling is important. You don't have to gather data on everybody all the time to draw conclusions about whether something works or not. Nobody else does this, guys. I blame learning management systems because they give you the illusion that you could gather data about everybody all the time, and you just get too much data to handle and nobody does any evaluation on the back of it. Sampling is scientific. Happysheet stuff is not. And of course, by the time you've got your Happysheet data and it's too late, the damage is done anyway, you've delivered the course, what are you going to do? Are you going to say it's crap? Not really. So it assumes the course is... And this obsession with happiness, as if the world is a simple calculus of happiness, like a thermometer going up and down, No, it ain't. We went through this debate in the 18th and 19th century with Bentham and Mill. We know it's not true. We know it's not true. It's not about keeping people happy. I actually hope I'm pissing a few people off here, If everybody said, well, everybody left the lecture hall happy, Donald, I go, well, that was a bloody mistake. What was the point of me turning up? If I just told them something they knew and they liked, what is the point of that? We don't have enough contention in this industry. We don't challenge ourselves enough, which means we get stuck in these ruts. The Happysheets being one of them. Okay, I've given some general attacks on the Happysheet things, but this girl here, Sitzman, who wrote these 2 papers, is an expert on this. Expert on the scientific methodology and on sampling and all this jazz about, in the learning world, what do users actually feel about themselves in terms of the reaction of their self-assessment. And to cut to the quick, I'll show you what she says, but she thinks Happysheets are a complete and utter waste of time. Okay? And let me show you the research she did to show this. 68,000 people, and she looked at the big meta-study on 354 results, types of courses, okay? Do satisfied students learn more than dissatisfied students? So the Happysheets quite often tease out this, were you happy, were you satisfied with the course, or whatever. And it's very strange here. If you control for some of the pre-training knowledge, to cut to the quick on this, the variance in terms of whether you're satisfied or not makes hardly any difference to the actual learning at all. So the answer is just no. Don't believe students when they give you a sort of happy reaction to courses. Because they love really shit courses where there's loads of jokes. And they just sit back passively and watch videos and have a laugh and have a lunch and get drunk on the night of the course so that they're not capable of learning the next day. They have a whale of time. Plus they've had a couple of days off work. Who wouldn't be fucking happy at that? Doesn't say a damn thing. Learning's hard. Learning is damn hard. You ever try to learn a language or learn physics? It's bloody hard. It ain't about being happy. It's about focus, psychological focus, retention into long-term memory, spaced practice. It's about getting down and doing it, not being happy. Are self-assessments of knowledge accurate? Well, self-assessment is only moderately related to learning. In other words, when you ask people what they've learned or how confident they are about whether they know this stuff or not, self-assessment captures motivation and satisfaction, but not actual knowledge levels. So people suffer from self-delusion when they're assessing themselves in this through the Happysheet method. if you've not objectified it. So our recommendations are that self-assessment should not be included in course evaluations, and you should not be using them as a substitute for objective learning methods. In other words, the real evaluation should be further up the line with more objective external assessment of the student's competence and not their own views and reactions themselves. And if you want a really good book to read, I made a big mistake on Amazon. Have you ever done this before? You type in, for some reason you get 2 in the box and you get 2 books through. You ever done that in Amazon? You're really annoyed when it comes through. Anyway, I've got 2 copies of this. Absolutely fantastic. Smile or Die by Barbara Ehrenreich. And it's an attack on positive thinking and the cult of happiness in the training world, in the financial world, and everywhere on earth in the world. This woman got breast cancer, and she was appalled at the way she was treated when she went into hospital, with thousands of counsellors telling her that she'll live longer if she's happy. And she's a smart woman, you know. She went back to the science, and there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that keeping positive extends your life when you have cancer. In fact, what she says, and she's right, what I want from my consultant is realism. I want somebody who knows what they're doing and is not peddling the snake oil of attitudinal shift. You know? And when you step onto the aeroplane, you don't want your pilot to be interested in happy flying. I want to know whether he can react properly if something really disastrous happens. I want a heavy dose of realism from my pilot. I don't want all this Tim Robbins, Tom Peters, happy-go-lucky, self-delusional, the imagination is all world. And as she says in the book, speak to any HR director and they will equate happiness or positive thinking with the word good. It's always good in HR, positive thinking, motivational speakers, all that bullshit. But it doesn't get us very far. Highly recommend this book. Don't have time to go into that in a whole lot of detail today. The second one, the pre-post test stuff. Now, a lot of the time the pre-testing doesn't take place whatsoever because by and large the training world takes batches of people, shoves them into a classroom, and then shoves them out the other end, having given them a short-term memory test. Quite often some crappy multiple choice thing, but that's the way of the world. The pre-testing is difficult. It's not actually easy to do pre-testing because you should be pre-selecting on the back of pre-testing and not shoving all those people through courses who don't need them. I've been on umpteen diversity training courses, and believe me, I don't need another one. How many diversity courses can an adult take in one lifetime? Because there is no pre-testing, pre-selection. Every member of the board has to do it. How stupid is that? In my secondary school, in my kids' French class, there's a kid who was brought up in France who speaks fluent French doing a GCSE in French. How fucking dumb is that? Why are we doing this? Why are we shoving people into these courses who, we need some of it, not all of it. There's no flexibility because the course, the timetabling of the course rules the roost on this one. And of course the whole thing, you don't really test for attitudinal very effectively, and it is a short memory experience, you know. All those qualifications I've gathered in my life, degrees, I've forgotten every damn thing, you know. Because the mind is a forgetting machine. We know that this is the case, and that we need spaced practice and reinforcement and things beyond the course to make it work. And one of my favourite theorists of all time, Mr. Ebbinghaus, that good old German, 1885, he gave us the theory which we've dutifully ignored for 125 years, which is you don't shove people in a room, give them a test at the end, and shove them out into the real world, because they'll forget almost every damn thing you taught them. The way you do it is to bootstrap the learning by having spaced practice over time, and then they start applying this knowledge in the real world. And learning takes a long time. You know, it takes a hell of a long time. And if you go and ask a really serious memory theorist about how long it takes to really consolidate memories, some of them say, oh, about 30 years. You know, you forget all the time. People forget things. You know, if you've ever been on a language training, if you've learnt a language, even if you're in your 20s, second language, if you don't practice it, it really falls off. You know, you've really struggled later in life. So we're always forgetting things, which is why the testing thing, short-term testing, is massively inefficient. But it's the orthodoxy. And we're frightened of doing serious testing because we might just find out that if we do give a test 3, 4, 5 months down the line, they might have forgotten every damn thing. So in the Happysheet thing, I think there's nothing wrong with actually sending out an email 3 months after the experience. That's fine, I'm cool with that, you know. when people really maybe have time to reflect and judge whether it has had any effect in the real world. Similarly with testing. Why aren't we testing way down the line when the stuff, because it's difficult. And of course technology is the only real way of doing that effectively. Now there are several other reasons why I think people fear level 3, sort of judgment of behavior, or level 4. One is quite simply fear. If you put your heart and soul into building a training course, delivering it for a very large number of people in an organization, it's a pretty daunting task to be really honest and say, I'm now going to put this through the mill of true and honest evaluation. So I think fear often stops us driving it up into that level 4 thing. And then there's straightforward disinterest. I have no problem with disinterest. I think that's quite a healthy thing. You don't have to audit everything. And if you feel you can't isolate the training variable in terms of level 4, don't bother. Why try and apply a scientific and mathematical model if you know with mathematical and scientific certainty that you're not going to be able to isolate the training variable? It won't matter. It's just a flawed experiment. And of course, this is the big one. A lot of trainers don't do evaluation because you've just finished that one, you're on to the next one. You just don't have time to breathe. You don't have the time. You don't have the money because it's expensive. If you really cost out the Kirkpatrick model, one of its massive weaknesses, very often for small training courses, it would cost you more to evaluate than to deliver the course in the first place. So why bother? Just wing it. Deliver the course and move on. It's incredibly expensive to do all 4 levels because it's so massively over-engineered. If you do it properly and really apply the maths and stats, it's amazingly expensive. And what you should be doing is bringing experts from the outside because there's hardly ever in training departments enough stats expertise to do it properly. That's not a criticism, it's just that's true in lots of departments. It's difficult and it's disruptive. You're disrupting everybody when you evaluate things because you're stopping them from doing their job. And then level 4. Now, so that's been a big demolition job, right? Woof, 1, 2, and 3. And I'm saying level 4's got something in it here. But that's obvious, You are in the business of helping employees fulfill the objectives of the organization. You're not in some general educational, some of you may be. This is not education, it's training. Let's get real here. It's about the organizational needs, the business needs, or in the public sector, the organizations themselves. So, let me pause there for a minute, because does anybody violently disagree with my views on levels 1, 2, and 3? No? Would anybody die for that and go back and say, no, I'm going to stay? No? Okay. Does anybody, any other sort of queries about my sort of Cartesian demolition of the theory at all? Because I'm not saying, I'm not saying I don't spend all my time looking at Kirkpatrick every day, but I may have missed a few things here.
I'd like to add something.
Sure, okay.
Psychological damage on trainers who read the smiley sheets straight after the training.
Yeah, well, that's right. Because the data is flawed, and very interesting, I was at Online Educa, and that actually happened to me. They got thrust these things in the speaker's room, and it was absolutely classic. It was a big, wild, cage-fighting type debate. The proposition was, are children's minds damaged by use of technology? And we had an academic who said they are, absolutely, don't use it. And then I was up against them, and we took a big vote at the end. And, of course, the people who agreed with the other guy were absolutely scathing about me, He should never have been allowed to speak at this conference. How dare he? He's not a scientist. Blah, blah, blah. And then other people, really brilliant, the people who agreed with me, said, brilliant, you really smashed into him, Donald, blah, 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 blah. What is that telling you, in a way, Only whether people liked you or not. And the data is weird, because it's not meaningful in terms of whether people got anything. In actual fact, you come away going, no, that was good. At the end of that, I thought that was a brilliant session, because we got exposure to some science, we got some real debate, and the audience took a vote at the end. There was massive audience participation, so everybody thought it was a success. When you read the Happysheet type stuff, you think it was a psychological failure, because people were so sort of weirdly worked up about it all.
I treat it like Japanese presents. You have to open the present straight away, and I won't do that.
Yeah.
So I always looked at those smiley sheets when I was training the following day.
Further down the line.
And it was great.
Absolutely.
So I never ever looked at them.
Yeah. But even better, I think, is this. There was somebody who, on a blog somewhere, who said that they called it Kirkpatrick level 1.5, which is this: don't do it immediately. Wait. Do it by email further down. And I have some sympathy with that view. I think that if you're going to do it, because there is something about Happysheets that's quite useful. If you want to know whether people like the biscuits, we should get chocolate ones next year. Fair enough. That's nothing to do with learning. know, if we're focusing on our jobs, the management of training courses is different from whether the outcomes and what we're really about. And by focusing on the Happysheets, I don't know, I've not read your Happysheet, but I'd be happy if you tore it up, to be honest. But I'm sure it's got lots of questions about the sessions and the management of the process and whether you're allowed to do this, that, and the next thing. That's just management. It's not what I'm talking about. Now, the point I mentioned earlier on here was that... Any other questions? Sorry. Oh, okay. Right, let's move on then. The rewards to an evaluator for producing a favourable evaluation, coming back to the point made earlier, report, often greatly outweighs the rewards for producing an unfavourable report. Boy, how true is that? How many people actually bring in a completely objective body to evaluate the training courses? I mean somebody who's really hard-nosed. There are a couple of people in the audience who are... yeah, exactly. I was going to point to you, Stu. Some people do it, but really, if we're doing this testing a drug for release in the market, you would get peer-reviewed medical trials done with control groups, randomized sampling, and a good methodology. We have to do that in training, but to do it properly, you have to pump in objectivity. So doing it yourself destroys the very effort itself because you're going to be positive about it all. That's the problem. We have optimism bias, you know. I don't know if any of you in the audience, I'm sure some of you are married. When you get married on day one and you ask the bride and groom whether they'll be together in 30 years' time, every single couple will say with absolute certainty, of course we will, except a few prenup rich people. And of course the truth of the matter is that 50% of those people will have split up. We know that with absolute scientific certainty across cultures. And yet still we suffer from this massive dose of optimism which ruins projects, creates banks and bubbles and financial catastrophes, and life goes on. That's why we have to bring in science and objectivity. Okay? Now let's ask a question. If I've done this demolition job and I want to build up again, you know, let's say, well, what should we be doing here? Let's move into the second half. Why are we evaluating? Now, my own personal view is that this is a really important word, because if you really ask that word why, I think a lot of people evaluate without asking why. They just do it. Patrick, Happysheets, boom, done. I personally think it's all about this. If you're sitting above the training department as a senior manager, or if you're an HR director, or you're on the board, this is what you do for a living. You do a lot of this. And you want to make decisions about whether you're going to run that course again next year, whether you want to improve the course, whether you want to bin it and cancel it, whether it's not actually a training problem, it's some other sort of problem. That's the data you need. And at that level, they don't want 150 pages of Kirkpatrick data or printouts from your learning management system. They want something really short, because it ain't that important to them, to be honest. They see it as fairly indirect. You know, training's like going over your head to scratch your ear for a lot of these guys. You know, they're used to hard-headed numbers at board level and spend a lot of time dealing with hard cache datas and hard data. And when it comes to training and all that Kirkpatrick stuff, boom, ain't interested. But fine-tune yourself into what decisions they're going to be making on terms of your budget and what they want for the organization, and you really start to hone in on evaluation that helps them, because that's what it's about. We're a service department within an organization, like marketing, like the legal department and so on. None of those guys, the lawyers in the organization, don't go around distributing Happysheets every time they write a contract. No, they don't do any of this stuff, other departments. It's only us. We're the only obsessives. And the realpolitik in organizations is you have to understand who's making decisions, what decisions they're likely to be making. If we focus on that for a moment, we'll get somewhere. You know, that age-old business question. What problem is this training course a solution? Because very often there ain't no problem in diversity training and compliance training and leadership training. There's an imaginary problem that's sometimes dreamt up by the training department. And in my time in this industry, we've had all transactional analysis, we've had leadership training, big one, what's the big one now? Talent management. Yeah, I'm sure that's the next one. I'm sure there's a lot of bullshit around in that area as well, because the training people have seen a way of holding on to budget and doing something different that appeals to senior managers. You know, and life goes on. But you're not really addressing the core issues on growing your company or whatever the objectives are. And the objectives are weird sometimes when you take this attitude, because it sometimes really surprises you. I'm sure all those old people who've been around in training for a while will know that there's some really weird objectives that senior managers want. I've put this one in here because this happened to me, maybe trainee suicides. I was heavily involved in military training and deep cut. Now, many of you will, from that one word, know what deep cut means. When I say deep cut, what does it mean to you? Suicides. Deep cut was a training facility, no more, no less. Young kids, under 18, went in, were given guns. No other army in the world gives guns to under 18-year-olds in training facilities and live ammo. And in that institution, the kids were so traumatized, so bullied by staff and other trainees that 5 of them put bullets in their head. So the problem in the British Army in training became this, and it was all over the papers, which is why you know it, you know? This is the problem they had to solve. And have they solved it? Not really. Deep cut still exists. Some of this bullying, horrible, they still give guns to those kids. There was no real reflection on it. In fact, there was a massive defensive knee-jerk by the MOD to say it had nothing to do with them. It had nothing to do with them. They weren't suicides. Some of those kids were murdered. And so sometimes there are really serious political things in organizations that mean you have to take evaluation of the learning and training and your methodology very seriously indeed. And then there we haven't got any other lessons. I mean, the military today still, this is why we've still got the Typhoon fighter and aircraft carriers, and almost every service has these huge bits of equipment that are absolutely of no use in theater in Afghanistan and Iraq, because we have this massive defensive process in defense training, which is all built around training people to use equipment. You buy loads of kit and you train people to use it. It's not always true. They have some exemplary officer training and team training. Some brilliant stuff takes place in the British Army in all 3 services. But they are absolutely stuck in a rut. And now they're fighting each other. So the head of the Navy is coming out and throwing punches at the head of the Army because they want this budget and it's no longer appropriate, and on it goes. Staff retention might be a big one. Because I remember somebody describing the HR department there as like accident and emergency. You know, people were so traumatized by the pressure they would put up in the IT area in the Royal Bank of Scotland, they were sort of crashing all over the place. So sometimes that's a big one. Sometimes it's just firefighting. But it's always slightly different from what you think it is in terms of the decision that people are going to be making down the line. And I think the real trick here is to keep things simple, because decision-making needs short, sharp, validated data so that you can sum things up quickly. You only have a very short period of time and get on and make the decisions. Now, here's an interesting question. I went to a number of years ago by this guy, Stephen Kerr, who was the chief learning officer, worked under Jack Welch. And he said something that absolutely stunned me. Kirkpatrick asked all the wrong questions, fine, agreed with him there. Learning is not a commodity. It's a very interesting statement, that. He just said, no, you can't isolate the variables here. It's not possible. And if you're doing it properly, if you're doing your job properly, you will be doing all that awareness and self-confidence building, self-development, the brilliant work that training people do in the organization, but don't pretend for 1 minute that you're going to be able to accurately measure the outputs at the top. He said, there's nothing wrong with that. He said, live with that. Lots of areas in life do this. They have an element of faith in them because we're pretty sure that some of this is going to work and some of it's going to stick. And if we didn't train people, it would be a disaster and so on. And I thought that was refreshingly honest. And I think a lot of organizations actually do this by default anyway. They don't bother. But I don't think there's anything wrong with consciously saying, no, I'm not going to do this, because the data won't be meaningful. That's okay. Anybody disagree with that? Now, and going back 50 years, there's loads. This list appears quite a lot on the web. There are lots of evaluation theories around, and some of them are pretty good. Certainly, many of them are far, far superior to the Kirkpatrick model, because the Kirkpatrick model is not a theory. There's no validation and so on. Some of these, at least, have gone and actually researched the basic methodology and come up with something quite useful. If you're interested in looking at overviews, there's a couple of good books on this. This here by a Steffel-Bottom guy, and some of them tend to look at evaluation in the context of education, but these are 2 reasonable books in terms of giving you summaries of these, because it is horses for courses. We're stuck with Kirkpatrick, but when you really look at evaluation theories, some evaluation theories are better for some contexts than others. So we shouldn't really necessarily be locked down into one. If you come along today looking for a magic silver bullet And I'm going to say, dump Kirkpatrick, but here's Donald Clark's theory of evaluation. Forget it, because it ain't like that. The real world isn't like that. Evaluation's a bit of a messy business, and it's a bit like horses for courses. Some of them which I quite like, one I like the Binkerhoff success case method. The reason I like this is it gets to things quickly. In other words, the largely qualitative techniques which Binkerhoff uses is to find out quickly what's working and what's not. By and large, through questionnaires and all that sort of stuff, a sort of Happysheet thing, way down the line, though, looking at real impacts in the organisation amongst a wide range of stakeholders. And they're mining away for best and worst cases. And it's all about the impact in the organisation. He really just forgets about 1, 2, and 3 and says, success cases, go for that. I like it. It's quick, it's easy, and it focuses on qualitative analysis. And then there's the responsive evaluation, which is a mixture of quantitative and qualitative, which is, again, get out there, observe, respond, but customize your evaluation to the situation. This responsive thing's all about being responsive to the context and the objectives of those decision makers that I mentioned earlier. Another good, short, sharp method. Some of these can be over-engineered as well. And the one I particularly like is Stufflebeam's, the CIPP model, which is, I'm not going into this in a huge amount of detail, but the context is important when you're delivering this stuff within an organization. The political context, the technical context, the bandwidth problems you're going to have, how line managers are going to roll this stuff out, the needs, the assets, and the problems with the defined environment. We all know that we spend a lot of our life fighting like crazy to get things to work, and loads of problems here. Kirkpatrick doesn't tackle this at all. Then there's the inputs, the budgets, the plans, all that stuff, the whole process of training, and then the impact and effectiveness. I think following this means you can do stuff before you launch it, during and after, as opposed to Kirkpatrick, it's all after the event. It's interesting, he's actually changed his mind. He doesn't call it SIP now, he refers to decision accountability. I like that because one of the reasons I like this model is the absolute focus on decision-making. Evaluation is all about that for him, and that, in my book, is good. Okay, now, I'll quickly here, we'll get some debate going. And some of the things I've quite liked in evaluations, when people are contextualizing it and looking at decision-making. There's a guy called Joe Machi who's the head of ADL. Anybody heard of ADL, the Advanced Distributed Learning? They were the people who invented SCORM and all those standards that have been the bane of your life, no doubt. Complete waste of time, SCORM most of the time, that passing data back and forth that nobody ever uses. But the ADL guy, he's in the American military, he's based in the Pentagon, and every year he sits in a big room with 24 other people, and they have to fight like crazy for their budget. And he knows what the decision makers are like. They're hard-nosed, stiff military types in uniforms who care about numbers, and that's all they care about, tragically. So he'll give them big numbers, 1 million hours of courseware delivered, but he'll deliver it in a very succinct way, and he'll gives them 3 slides, and these are the 3 slides. The first one, which is in his online distribution model, the Joint Command model, he's showing that the cost per course was $300, and that over time, over every quarter, the cost absolutely plummets to next to $5, $8 down the line here. He knows that that's his killer punch when he walks in the room, because he knows who the decision maker is, he did his homework, he knows what the decision has to be, and he knows that there are budget cuts. On top of that, his third slide, the only other slide he showed, was positive ROI that creates in a very simple graphic form. Now, if I were on a board, this is what I'd want. I'd want those 3 slides from that guy, because his is all about this massive distribution of fairly simple military courses using an online system straight into Iraq and Afghanistan, where those guys are most of the time, or in various places which they move around in the US. This is the sort of contextualized, decision-based numbers approach which I greatly admire. But it's not the only way of doing it, It may be that your organization just wants to save time. In sales departments and marketing departments, they hate it when salespeople are taken offline. They hate it with a vengeance. They know that sales training has to take place, but they want it to be as short as possible. And gone are the days when we went away on 6-week induction courses to country houses. They all got sold off in the 70s and 80s. And then all the courses came down to 1 week and 2 weeks. Now it's down to 1 day. Sometimes you're down fine-grained level to the hour. Everything's got shorter because saving time really matters for decision makers. They all resent you having to take people off for training. That may be the criteria that matters. Excuse me. And again, I don't think there's any harm in going out into the market and looking at the research. Other people have looked at this. Does it save time using e-learning as opposed to classroom training or other blended methods? Yes, it does. Here's the data. Tell them. There's nothing wrong with that, objectifying the knowledge from the science base. Does it result in better learning? Again, you can go back to the research and look at this, because your Happysheets and your level 2 assessments won't tell you much about that unless the level 2 assessments are really good and done in the line. And Fletcher, who's written the best training book I've ever read, which is out of print now, called Training and Retraining by the American Psychological Society, published by them. He says, by and large, it comes down to the third rule here. The use of technology-based instruction can be reduce the cost of instruction by a third, increase learning by about a third, and reduce time by a third. And if you're playing to those variables, you can then tailor that in terms of your evaluation, objectifying the evidence and pump it up the ladder to the people who want to hear those things. Now, of course, we have a big problem, because the old Maslow thing, if you've seen me speak before, I've showed this slide quite a lot. Maslow, absolutely basic needs stuff. The fact that people need a house to live in before they learn. I know of no more theory that's dumber and more obvious than the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Also, it's wrong. It is absolutely wrong. It isn't a hierarchy of needs. It's much more complicated. Maslow has nothing to tell us about human nature. Absolutely nothing. He did come up with a line, however, which is, if you walk around with a hammer, everything starts, often enough, everything starts to look like a nail. And one of the problems we have with evaluation is the evaluative schema we have in Kirkpatrick is suitable for classroom courses, that old behaviours thing, but it's absolutely hopeless when it comes to social networking, games, simulations, and everything else that we have. It's absolutely hopeless. So we're using an ancient behaviourist theory for a far more sophisticated fit. You'll get nowhere trying to evaluate a social networking initiative in your organization using Kirkpatrick. Nowhere fast. So all this stuff that's hit us, I'm not wholly convinced that a lot of this is good. I've started going back and saying, second life, that I've sort of given up usefulness in learning and training. However, I'm still a massive fan of this. The EDU, iTunes, those lectures online, big fan of all that stuff. I like the blogging for that more leading edge way of theory. Twitter, Facebook certainly revolutionized my life, this one certainly. And all the gamesy stuff that's coming out, simulations, I would prefer to use that term. If we're going to evaluate that properly, we have to be more sophisticated in our evaluation methods and dump Kirkpatrick, or we won't get anywhere. In actual fact, what will happen is Kirkpatrick will stop us doing this stuff. It will just put the brakes on it all. That's what will happen. Okay, so last slide. Kill Kirkpatrick. Don't mean literally, although that would help. He's still got his son. No doubt there's a grandson waiting in the wings there to take up the theory as we go on. Because the business of training is business. It's about business, Even in the public sector, there are organizational objectives that have to be met. We have to focus on that. We should be using the language of business, not the language of training. The language of training is bloody awful. Trainers, training, learning, lectures, instruction. My kids get Claxton did all this research in classrooms. The word most frequently used by teachers in classrooms when they refer to learning is work. Get your work out. Have you done your work? Have you finished your work? Have you done your homework? Get that work out. Work? For a 9-year-old? Give them a break. The language of training is really awful and misguided at times. What we need to learn is the language of business. Customize the decision makers, customize the decisions. Don't harvest sample. If there's one simple thing you can do to change your life, it's just sample with regard to training courses and trainees. That's all you have to do. You have to sample cleverly. It should be randomized. It should be representative and not make it significant, but it's a well-trodden path. Okay, I'll end there, but thanks very much for listening, and let's maybe get some juicy debate going. Do we have much time left?
2 minutes.
All right.